Hello, everybody. We're already into the middle of January 2025. It's a new world, a brave new world of great power politics. And I'm guessing that one of the words of 2025 will be the word border, not describing the old bookstore, but those lines between nations. We seem to be increasingly living in an age of great power politics, perhaps returning to the 19th century. The border between Ukraine and Russia will become a major story, no doubt. It already was in 2024 and will remain in 2025. The new American president has been making his own inimitable suggestions about broadening the US borders through Canada, Greenland, Panama. And it's even possible that the borders of Taiwan and China will become controversial and problematic in 2025. And then, of course, there's Europe and the Schengen Agreement. The Europeans have always had perhaps a culture of superiority, suggesting that while the rest of the world is in crisis, the Europeans do it well. Some people even talk about Europe without borders, a place where you can travel around the EU without having to show your passport. But my guest today, Isaac Stanley-Becker, whose day job is with the Washington Post and who studied in Oxford, has a new book out, Europe Without Borders, A History, which I think is an ironic title to describe Schengen. Isaac, congratulations on the new book. What do you make of my thesis that borders might be one of the big words of 2025?
I think it's spot on. And while much of the world's attention, as you say, might be riveted on other borders, whether that's between Russia and Ukraine, whatever that border ends up looking like, or on the US southern border, which is certainly a major focus of the president-elect here in the United States, there are important questions to be asked and discussions to be had about European borders. One of the key findings in my book is the way that the treaty makers behind Schengen conceived of this area of free movement as a laboratory, as a way to experiment with and figure out ways of coming up with a system of market freedom across borders, of multiculturalism and pluralisms, incubating civic ideals of multinationalism. So they conceived of it as an experiment and as a laboratory. And if that's right, I think we should be thinking about Schengen and about Europe as a place where what happens there will be felt elsewhere, whether that's in the US or further east, outside of the confines of the European Union or elsewhere. So some of these considerations are global, and I think disagreement and contest over borders is certainly going to be a global concern in 2025 and going forward.
Yeah, with the digital revolution, Isaac, we were promised that physical things wouldn't matter anymore. You're owned by a digital baron, at least at the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos. He was one of these new billionaires, perhaps even trillionaires now, who promised that the physical doesn't matter. What happened? Why is the physical in 2025? Why does it seem so much more important than it did, especially when it comes to soil and territory? Are we really returning to the 19th century, the age of nationalism and nation?
Oh, Andrew, I'm so sorry. Here's this call. I think it'll take 90 seconds, I hope.
And then you can respond to the question. Don't worry. Go on.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem. So you're good now.
Yeah, I'm good, and hopefully no more interruptions. Sorry, so the question was a good
So
one,
I'll
and
ask
it
the
was
question again,
okay,
and then
that'd be
we can
great.
I'll just splice it. Okay. Um, we're going to come to Schengen in a second, but looking more broadly, are we returning to the 19th century when it comes to borders, with American now casting its eye over Greenland and the Panama Canal? Already wars of 19th century colonialism in the eastern part of Europe, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this brewing crisis over Taiwan. Is this a return to the great power politics of the 19th century?
I think I'd be loath to make too sweeping of predictions, and in some ways would treat each of these as a case in its own, while certainly pointing towards some commonalities. The discussion of Greenland and Panama Canal, it certainly does seem, I would agree with you, to hark back to a kind of earlier a vision, a nostalgia, and a sense of kind of superpower, imperial power projection. It's rather extraordinary, and I look forward to additional reporting about what unfolds here, and also what people, including the leaders of Greenland and other places, make of some of this discussion. In Europe, it's interesting, and I think the picture is complicated because you look at opinion surveys, and there is still a great degree of appreciation for free movement and the ability to pass without papers and without hindrance among these nations, to live in one in France and work in Germany, or vice versa, and to move in that way. At the same time, we're seeing such a heightened degree of concern about issues of immigration, and also the political dynamics here have become so explosive and toxic in terms of the way that this is being played on by certain factions in European countries. So I think it's contested, because there certainly it has been exposed as a major concern and been seized on in the political realm. At the same time, I don't think that there is a popular desire to scrap this system and go back to a kind of earlier mode in Europe. So uh, my sense is that there will be a continuation of some sort of muddling through of heightened controls, heightened restrictions, and yet continued adherence, at least in name only, to some of these principles. That's why in the book I talk at the end a little bit about the death of Schengen by 1,000 cuts. So what does it mean when you proclaim principles of free movement, but you have Germany, the largest economy in the EU, currently having border controls at all of its land borders? That's a real contradiction that
So
we need
before
to
we
be
get to
aware
the
of.
end of the book, not everyone will be familiar with Schengen, or even the promise, the dream of the EU, which of course came out of two catastrophic wars in the 20th century. Contextualize the Schengen dream, the borderless dream, in the context of the history of the EU, Isaac.
Well, one could go back even further, actually, to ideas in Romanticism, Enlightenment ideas about cosmopolitanism, about pan-Europeanism, joining this space, and putting an end to warfare, and uniting the peoples of Europe. After the war, what part of what the book teases out is a contest about post-war visions for union, and is there going to be a kind of federal system similar to what we have in the U.S.? Is there going to be a federal system that's rooted in a vision of kind of social democracy and civic solidarity? Or is it going to be a more strictly economic ideal, what you could even call a neoliberal ideal of fusing markets, of preventing government intervention in kind of a conjoined or joined economic space? And it really is the latter that wins out in the Treaty of Rome. It's largely a commercial and economic paradigm. At the same time, there are these somewhat stillborn ideals of a more civic vision of European
Although, to be
integration.
fair, Isaac, in historical terms, I mean, when was the Treaty of Rome?
1957.
Right. I mean, even the term neoliberal didn't exist then. This was just a pro-market idea. Not all pro-market ideas are neoliberal, are they?
No, but these were ideals that would coalesce under what we would now call neoliberal. So you have Hayek writing about a European Union as a way of preventing state interference in the market and fusing trade and removing barriers to the free flow of commerce, services, capital, and this would certainly become what we think of as ascendant neoliberalism.
Was there, I mean, you mentioned traveling between Germany and France. Those were the two pioneers of the European Union, still remain the two dominant powers in the EU. Was there a French and a German dream? Who is more comfortable with a borderless Europe? Is it the Germans or the French?
It's a great question, and I think that there are points during the long years of treaty making, not just in the Schengen Accord itself, which is the initial agreement is signed in 1985, the longer, more complex implementing convention in 1990, but in some of the discussions before and after that become kind of important pieces of this. I think it passes back and forth, and there is this partnership between François Mitterrand of France and Helmut Kohl of West Germany that really drives this initiative. And there is it's infused with this idea of a Franco-German reconciliation. Of course, these historic adversaries that had united and become these powerful players in European integration, and that's central to the creation of free movement and the creation of Schengen. It's Mitterrand in 1984 who proclaims this idea of citizens Europe, and that is an important spur for Schengen and the ideals that Schengen purports to represent and speak to. Of course, for West Germany and for Kohl, there remains this kind of historic debt, sense of responsibility that makes it an important player and an important driver of this initiative. For somewhat circumstantial reasons, it's France that ends up playing, I would say, one of the diplomatic documents refers to a locomotive effect here. It chairs the central negotiating group at really critical junctures, including in 1985, right after the first agreement is signed. And then importantly, in 1989, a year of great rupture and also a year of great importance to Schengen, because it's then in 1990, in the summer of 1990, when the implementing convention is finalized and then goes to the member states for ratification. Of course, 1989 is also a somewhat perilous moment for Schengen.
Supposedly, as one American famously said, the end of history, of course, only the beginning, really. Isaac, a couple of thoughts on this. Firstly, it's ironic that France, in a sense, was the driver, given that the French have always had the most distinct sense of culture and nationhood and a great deal of ambivalence about full integration. So perhaps you might address that. But I also, how in parallel is the legislation on Schengen and the introduction of the euro? Are they connected, or are these parallel events?
Sure, I'll take the second one first. They're parallel because Schengen is actually negotiated and, in fact, implemented outside the forum of European Community and then European Union decision making. It's formed, negotiated, signed at the intergovernmental level, in large part because there was thinking at the time that this was actually not a European Community competence to provide for free movement in this way, divorced in some ways from commercial concerns, economic enterprise, and the free movement of workers and workers qua workers. It's only in 1997 with the Treaty of Amsterdam, which then goes into effect in 1999, that Schengen is incorporated into EU law. So one of the interesting things in doing this book was sort of taking something that is so interwoven with the fabric of European Union law, the fabric of European life, and figuring out that its origins were quite distinct and happening, as you put it, in parallel. In terms of France, to say that France was in the driver's seat is not to say that there wasn't great dissent in France and elsewhere against what was happening here. And much of that dissent spills forth once the implementing convention goes to the member states for ratification in 1990 and 1991. France is the first country to take this up, and there is absolutely vexed debate in the National Assembly about the logic of this and about ideals of French republicanism, the indivisibility and inviolability of the French nation. Certainly, there are neo-Gaullist members of parliament who are just incensed by the notion that there would have been this agreement negotiated somewhat clandestinely in secret and removed from parliament and the people, and that this violates just core constitutional principles. So that's a debate that I tease out and is really quite interesting, and also interesting in uniting the political extremes. So you have the right, the neo-Gaullist right, as well as the far right. The National Front becomes an important player here.
And this was Le Pen's father at the time, I'm guessing.
That's exactly right. United with the communists and the left, who are concerned with other aspects of the agreement, primarily some of the heightened security, some of the potential restrictions on asylum guarantees that they see as unconstitutional for somewhat wholly different reasons, and yet both related to questions about sovereignty and national responsibility, whether that's national responsibility for security, border controls, and so forth, or asylum and accountability to succor the world's dispossessed and mistreated.
Isaac, stepping back a bit in terms of grand historical terms, you mentioned 1989, the year, of course, the wall came down, Germany was reunited. I'm guessing that German thinking on Schengen changed dramatically then too. But might Schengen be seen as one of those monuments signifying the end of the Cold War?
Well, this is such a key moment of the history, and it's one of the pieces of the book that I just found so fascinating to research, because this is all done with West Germany and with the assumption of a divided Germany and a divided Berlin, and that basically goes unquestioned. The status of Germany and of Berlin is not much a focus of the treaty making, of the discussions. And then all of a sudden, Eastern Europe is swept by these peaceful revolutions, and the wall comes down, and it throws into question the promises of Schengen, because if you build this system and you devise these security mechanisms too on the assumption about where the border is going to fall, and then all of a sudden there's this prospect that Berlin's going to become one, Germany's going to become one, and the eastern frontier of Schengen is going to move further out, it raises all these concerns about the risks of free movement. So what the fall of the wall does initially is actually imperil Schengen. And the irony of this is not lost on the press or on the treaty makers, who say how remarkable that a treaty to dismantle borders is faltering because of the fall of a border. And this is also...
And a wall, of course, the wall which was both symbolically and literally the thing that divided East and West and marked the ground zero of the Cold War.
That's exactly right. And what has to be figured out is the status of a potentially and likely reunified Germany. And this is a real flashpoint between France and Germany, going back to your earlier question about who wants what and whose interests look like what at what times, because there was concern in France and other places about a reunified Germany. There was also insistence by West Germany that these two countries would merge, that East Germany could not be treated like a foreign country with respect to West Germany when it came to the rules of free movement. So this is also another reason why Schengen is a historically important document more than we realize. It was the first international treaty to govern the status of Germany after the fall of the wall. And so the provisions that ended up appearing in the document about reunification and about East Germany not being a foreign country with respect to West Germany are become kind of foundational in the 1990s in reckoning with this brave new world.
Yeah, and of course it was an agreement made without East European later members of the EU. What about critics of Schengen within the EU at the time? I'm guessing that the British, of course, who are no longer part of the EU, weren't particularly keen on it right from the beginning. Of course, they were one of the countries that rejected the idea of the euro too. Who was the most in your view at least, the most articulate critic? Which countries were the most articulate critics or individuals of Schengen, of its promise, of its reality?
There were critics. There were critics in all of the countries, really, and as I mentioned, there was an interesting alliance between the far right and the far left in having concerns about ceding national authority and national sovereignty, again, for very different reasons, whether it was security concerns or concerns about asylum and human rights. A really important critic of certain aspects of European integration, who's also a critic of Schengen and the rules of free movement, is Michel Debré, who the author of the 1958 French Constitution and a kind of inheritor of the tradition of de Gaulle, and he mounts an important early criticism to the development of free movement in the 1980s. He is, based on notions of the inviolability of the French nation, that you should not cede this authority to European partners or to Brussels. And then he's no longer in the National Assembly by the time Schengen comes before that body for ratification in 1991. But interestingly, his two sons are. And after the legislative opposition to Schengen fails in 1991 and the treaty is ratified, there's a judicial complaint. And both of Debré's sons sign their names to that complaint. So I think that opposition to Schengen is his legacy and his progeny.
These were critics from the continent. I'm guessing also the existence of the English Channel, the Irish Sea, contributed to the British and Irish ambivalence over it. Was Schengen conceived in physically contiguous continental terms? What did they make of the island members of the EU?
Well, initially, certainly, because you have 5 countries initially. You have the Benelux countries of Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, which actually have their pre-existing system of free movement prior to Schengen. And then you have France and West Germany, who in 1984, a year before Schengen, come up with a bilateral agreement to dismantle controls just between those two countries at their common border. So it very much is conceived as this contiguous system in Western Europe. And in fact, the whole reason it's signed in Schengen, this tiny, previously unknown town in Luxembourg, is because it sits at this tri-point border among Luxembourg, France, and West Germany. So it kind of embodies the natural integration of Europe and the natural integration of borders. But so I would say yes in a certain way, but also no, because for instance, West Berlin was considered part of Schengen from the beginning, even though it was obviously totally cut off from the rest of West Germany, going back to our prior discussion. So Schengen, and you see this also in the admission of new member states, where there will be sometimes a bifurcation between land and sea borders and what happens at airports, or vice versa. So just as important as driving across a border, which is very kind of symbolic of the system of open borders, flights and what happens in airports and passport checks, that's important as well.
You mentioned that Schengen is named after a small town in Luxembourg. Skeptics of the EU, and there are many of them, Isaac, don't need me to tell you that, have criticized the EU as a faceless union, built and controlled by bureaucrats, technocrats. Does the Schengen Agreement, for critics, reflect the EU at its worst, or perhaps at its best?
This is the answer to this question has so much importance for the fate of Schengen. And very late in the writing process, I was corresponding with one of the treaty makers, Robert Goebbels of Luxembourg, and he was taking such issue with the blame that Schengen gets for all of Europe's problems, whether it's migration or security or otherwise. He was saying Schengen is not at the root of all of these ills, and yet it is certainly so symbolic of the migration crisis in particular. So I think certainly for critics of the EU, for Eurosceptics, Schengen does embody the worst of the EU, negotiated at remove from certainly the popular will, but also the democratic process, a violation of national sovereignty, a restriction on national authority and national controls. And yet, as I mentioned, also free movement remains one of the prized aspects of European integration. So I think for European integrationists, it does remain a point of pride, and there are certainly rebuttals to these criticisms about national sovereignty and about security that have to do with the maintenance of national responsibility for certain security measures, and the fact that that has not been acted on sufficiently by the individual member states, or about broader geopolitical and global migratory trends, and the fact that there has been just unremitting crisis, whether it's COVID, the migration crisis of 2015, war in the Middle East, or war in Ukraine, and the pressure that all of this is putting on Europe's borders. So it's a
Right.
Rorschach test.
So before we get to all those pressures, which I think they're tragic, but also fascinating in terms of the history, not just of Schengen, but of Europe. This year, Schengen will be 40 years old, or the 40-year will be, I don't know if any Europeans will be celebrating it on the 14th of June, 2025. Very briefly, Isaac, what is the history of Schengen over the last 40 years? Is it just of it expanding essentially, and more European states who have become members of the EU joining it?
It has been a remarkable expansion. It starts with 5 countries in 1985. Now it's at 29, just encompassing a really vast swath of the continent. And there was a video just actually recently about Romania, which entered last year, but it went into effect on the 1st of this year. And there's a ceremony, the border with Hungary, and a dog was the first to cross the border, and you have people standing there clapping. So it's,
and of course, that border between Romania and Hungary has been an endless source of controversy and war between Hungary and Romania over the centuries.
That's exactly right. And I think that that's really important to note, and also reflects why, despite the criticisms for integrationists and for Europhiles, it remains such a point of pride, because it's an experiment that says these countries that have been at war with each other now not just cooperate, but have become almost one, that there is an ability to move between them, and to have that kind of freedom. But just in brief, 1985, initial charter of intent, 5 countries. 1990, this long, more complex implementing convention that sets out largely the security measures that come with this. 1995 is when this goes fully into effect, because you have a long process of ratification in the initial member countries. While some of this is going on, some of the first states that exceed join, so Italy, Spain, Portugal, some of the others. And then in the 2000s, it is a story of expansion. And once it becomes joined to the EU in 1999, once the Treaty of Amsterdam goes into effect, there is an assumption that EU member states will become members of Schengen, though this often takes a much longer period, because there's a complex inspection process where they have to prove that they have sufficient controls at their external borders, along with a number of other important considerations related to surveillance and digital technology, and so on and so forth. So, of course, in 2004, you have an important and widespread Eastern expansion, and then some of those states become Schengen members several years later. And then I think starting in 2013, 2014, 2015 is when you see just immense tests and challenges to the system of free movement, beginning with the migration crisis and the arrival of just unprecedented numbers of refugees from Syria and Afghanistan and elsewhere in the Middle East and North Africa, and the crisis hasn't really stopped since then.
Yeah, it's a place people want to come, and particularly from the Middle East, from the various wars there. You mentioned neoliberalism earlier, Isaac. To what extent has the history of Schengen been a history of the EU as a kind of laboratory for neoliberal policies, a kind of maybe not an open jail, but a place surrounded with strong borders from Greece to France to Italy to Spain, in which free markets and the principles of neoliberalism have proliferated over the last 40 years?
I think it has certainly been an important laboratory for that vision of Europe. At the same time, and this is the real complexity of Schengen, it also had within it this notion of civic solidarity, of a vision of free movement that would not just be attached to commercial pursuits. And that very broadening, that very removal of the stamp of economism, of the stamp of commercial enterprise, is actually what gave legitimacy to the completion of the single market and to the vision of economic integration. So there is a very keen understanding that to legitimate the single market, to legitimate this fusion of markets, you have to establish a civic, a social, and a political substratum, and that is what Schengen seeks to do. And yet, it doesn't simply provide that legitimacy. It also gives rise to these broader notions about the freedom to travel for people as people, not as economic actors, of civic solidarity, of citizenship, and of human rights. And certain critics of Schengen, critics of it from the perspective of human rights, of exclusion, who see it as an exclusionary, use its own logic against it, in arguing that this grant of free movement should be a universal human right, not restricted by citizenship, not assigned only to nationals of European Community member states.
And I'm guessing that view isn't particularly popular, certainly in places like Budapest. Isaac, last year Mario Draghi wrote a hard-hitting critique of European economic development, or perhaps the lack of development. Have people like Draghi connected Europe's seeming failure to compete with the US and Chinese economies, especially on innovation, new technology, with Schengen itself? How do people think of Schengen in terms of its economic consequences?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Not that I've seen in terms of some of the recent or semi-recent discussions about sluggish growth, about the need to innovate. I have not seen that connected to Schengen. During the peak years of the coronavirus pandemic and then onward, as many states were reintroducing controls, there were dire warnings, I believe, from the European Parliament or from the Commission, or perhaps both, about the costs of this, and arguing that there were severe costs to the single market, to economic competitiveness, to free trade, and so on. And so it is certainly positioned by European community institutions as a linchpin of economic competitiveness, economic development. But I have not seen necessarily counter arguments to that, but nor have I seen in the most recent round of discussions about the need to grow and pursue development this connected to Schengen, either arguments for it or critiques of it. You do see it connected to concerns about brain drains. So you open up the borders to places in Eastern Europe, and then you have young people all traveling to Paris or Berlin or elsewhere on the continent. But even that is complicated, because what Schengen does is allow for document-free travel. It doesn't establish a right of residence or those sorts of guarantees, which really come from other parts of
right. And the sort of changes, for example, in rural parts of Poland seem as much Poles going to the UK as they do going to France, although it's a kind of larger version of what's happening in countries like France anyway, where everyone goes to Paris. Of course, Isaac, the biggest development in Europe over the last 10 to 15 years has been the rise of indigenous populist parties. The Marine Le Pen in France, who's increasingly a powerful politician, Meloni in Italy, now who is prime minister, the rise of the AfD in Germany. Are these new populist parties, which are increasingly powerful, and then, of course, Orban in Hungary and similar developments in Poland and Romania, are they hostile to Schengen, or do they simply accept it as the reality of being part of the European Union?
They absolutely are hostile to Schengen. The one caveat I would just introduce is that with many of these parties and with many of these figures, there's a level of rhetoric, and then there's a level of policy and action, and we certainly see the hostility at the level of rhetoric, perhaps because some of these parties have not been in a position to govern, and perhaps for other reasons, though certainly Meloni, as you mentioned, Orban are. There has not been a kind of frontal assault on Schengen. Well, except for the fact that there is an across-the-board assault on it, including in states and by parties that are not seen as overtly hostile for kind of partisan political reasons. So you mentioned Orban. I would point out that when Germany in September of last year reintroduced controls at all of its land borders, this was cheered by Orban, who quote tweeted the announcement from Germany and said something along the lines of, welcome to the club, or you've caught up to my logic. And the National Front has been a longtime critic of Schengen, going back to 2014, 2015. There's an important moment when a leader in the party, maybe it's the deputy leader, actually goes to Schengen, goes to the site where this agreement was signed in Luxembourg, and lays a funeral wreath at the site of Schengen, at the museum there. So there's a performative aspect here that does speak to an underlying and important hostility to the agreement among these rising far-right parties in Europe.
And of course, in Germany, in reestablishing border controls, does that mark, it seems literally to me to mark the end of Schengen, because the whole point of Schengen is you can go through borders. But now if the Germans are reinstituting borders within the EU, does Schengen even exist anymore, given that Germany is the most powerful and largest country in Europe?
Well, there is a complexity here. So I was traveling and around last autumn and was stopped at a border checkpoint between France and Germany. But to reintroduce checkpoints at all land borders is not necessarily to say that at every moment, every person crossing the border is checked. There's still a certain amount of randomness and kind of spot checks to this, but that is certainly how it was and is perceived by defenders of Schengen and defenders of the vision of free movement. So when Germany made this announcement in September, it was criticized by the likes of Donald Tusk in Poland, who said this is unacceptable. It's the suspension of Schengen on a large scale. At the same time, the ability to derogate from its terms is built into the Schengen agreement. So the ability of member states to reintroduce controls is in the agreement itself. There are stipulations about it being temporary, about reasons for the reintroduction, and also about notification of the other member states. But this has not been adhered to across the board. And when there have been attempts by the European Court of Justice to rule on these questions, there has not been clear enforcement and not ready compliance by the member states.
Finally, Isaac, you're now based in the US. You did a lot of the research and writing for this book when you were studying at Oxford. You worked for the Washington Post. You're based in DC. 2025 is going to be a year. Who knows what's going to happen? It's going to be a year where we hear more and more about borders and illegal immigrants and what Trump is going to do to round up people who aren't supposed to be here, at least under the law. Bound to be huge debates and be a very interesting narrative. America, of course, in a sense, I guess, is America without borders. At the beginning of American history, there were Some of the founders believed that America should have borders and that states should resemble European countries. What does the history of Schengen, both in terms of its success and perhaps some of its questions and failures, what does it teach us about America, which is also grappling not so much with the question of literal borders, but internal ones and immigration, and of course, Trump's now looking to Canada. I mean, who knows how serious he is, looking to Canada and Panama Canal and Greenland to enlarge the United States?
I think two things come to mind. One is, you travel across the US and you experience as much diversity, variety as you do traveling the lengths of Europe, perhaps even more. Language aside, though, you could look at regional dialects as important in a similar way that different European languages are. And there is intense partisanship in the US, an intense sense that parts of the country are at odds with each other, perhaps terminally so, speaking about, a cold civil war, just an inability of Florida or Oklahoma or other places to be in a single civic unit with Massachusetts or Vermont. And one of the kind of enduring aspects of Schengen is this notion of pluralism, of cosmopolitanism. What does it mean to join unlike people as part of one project and to allow them to move freely within that system? And that's vexed, and it's vexed in the US as well, even though we don't have as strict borders among the states. The other thing, and maybe this is, I'm not sure whether this is a lesson that Schengen teaches the US or that the US teaches Europe under Schengen, but just how explosive these questions remain, and how we spoke about 1989 and the era of globalization that inaugurated the end of history. And if we don't, there is now so much evidence that is a kind of false notion, and that we are back to an era of deep conflict over borders, over immigration, and the recent election made that clear, but there have been many other factors here. And I think that part of what studying Schengen shows is that a lot of this was conflicted from the start, and even moments like 1989 that seemed like uncomplicated endorsements of visions of liberal internationalism or globalization contained within them seeds of dissent against that or conflict over the terms of that. And I think we're living with the consequences, or with all of that conflict really coming out into very public, visible view.
Well, history is certainly more complicated than it seems. Europe Without Borders, A History, is just out by Isaac Stanley-Becker, who now is based at the Washington Post. Isaac, fascinating conversation. It's not going away. Borders are bound to become more and more prominent. I hope you'll come back on the show, certainly at some point in 2025, to discuss the fate of borders, both in North America and Europe, in this year that is bound to surprise us, shock us, and maybe even make us happy. Thank you so much. Happy New Year.